Okay, thanks, George, and thank you, everybody, for coming along. It's a tremendous pleasure and honour to be able to be here in Moscow and also meet so many wonderful people who have shown an interest in my work, and also so many people I've met already who are doing other interesting things that are truly fascinating. And the next week I'm looking forward to very much. I must say, I don't normally go to such enormous conferences as the Eurasia Congress will prove to be. I'm normally just in my area conferences. I organize twice a year. I organise the Southeast Asian Linguistic Society conference and the International Conference of Austroasiatic Linguistics, but they're rather more modest affairs. Well, today I'm going to talk about proto-Austroasiatic, where we are, how we got there, and my thinking behind how I got to my latest results, and hopefully share some beneficial lessons from that. Does it move?
Yeah, should. Was about minutes ago.
Okay, all right. So just a quick overview. I don't know to what extent you know about Austroasiatic. So this is the principal substrate language for mainland Southeast Asia and Eastern India. Its presence in the area precedes the presence of any other known language family. Of course, there must have been other languages being spoken in the area before Austroasiatic, but we simply have no knowledge whatsoever, unless you count the Andaman Islands, but that's a bit of a sideshow. So the Austroasiatic languages extend from southern China. There's a very small number of communities scattered around in southern China, Yunnan basically, and neighbouring provinces. As far down as the Malay peninsula, where there are some tens of thousands of speakers. They're the Aslian group. But also in India, there are three populations in India, in Meghalaya, in the northeast India, the Munda, who was spread across a lot of eastern India and across to central India, in fact, and also the Nicobarese, which is part of India by some historical accident. All up there are probably more than 120 million speakers, but of them, about 100 million are Vietnamese. So most of them are quite small languages. Some millions in India. The other big group, which has any official status, is of course Cambodian. But otherwise, they're spoken by mostly very, very small groups, some only a few hundreds, some cases only some dozens, particularly very small mountain groups. So there are, well, until a week ago, I would have said there were 14 branches, but now I'm thinking there might be 15 branches, but that's going to be a matter of some robust debate at the next Austroasiatic conference. Yes. So about 4,000 years ago, or maybe a little before, something happened. Some East Asian rice and millet farmers moved down into the Red River Valley area and mixed with the local Wabinian people, who were hunter-gatherers and also cultivators of tubers, and of course great fishermen and makers of baskets and very simple pottery. They were Stone Age people. And with the movement of these East Asian cereal farmers into the area, there was a mixing of the population, and we now have a very clear archaeological record, and seen in the shapes of the skulls, in the dentition, and other physical anthropological evidence that shows that we had a mixing of two very different populations and the emergence of a new society. So there was an act of ethnogenesis occurred, and a social transformation that we call the late Neolithic revolution, or late Neolithic transformation. And as a result, there was quite a clean break in the cultural record revealed by archaeology, and we now had people who were farming irrigated paddy. They were now living in permanent pole houses, in permanent villages. They now had prone burials with grave goods, including jewellery, and those jewellery included quite elaborate carved jade necklaces and earrings and such that were apparently often imported from the Philippines. So there was some sort of cross-ocean trade going on as well. And instead of just hunting animals, they now domesticated and held animals for meat: dogs, pigs, goats, cattle. In fact, penned dogs were the largest single source of meat. And again, the archaeology is now quite clear. Within a relatively short space of time, only some hundreds of years, this culture dispersed and settled far and wide. It settled, as far as Malaysia. It settled up into India and into China, and right across as far as central India. Now, what happened? I have my own ideas, but I think we had people who valued living in estuarine environments where you had natural paddy irrigation. These environments where you have flats and with the natural changes in the river levels, they would actually irrigate the large areas with fresh water. Fresh water would rise and then go down again on a sort of annual cycle. And so you have these natural paddy environments. And that's something that goes on today in a big way still in central Cambodia, around the Tonle Sap Lake, where you have a vast area of like an inland sea that gets backfilled and then drained from the Mekong River. And so that's an economic pattern that seems to be associated with Austroasiatic culture for a long time and continues today where the circumstances permit. And of course, around that time, 4,000 years ago, sea levels in the area were between 1 and 2 meters higher than today. So the entire shape of the coastline was quite different, and we didn't have the great deltas. Certainly, we didn't have the great Mekong Delta here, Irrawaddy Delta here, etc. We didn't have such large naturally suited areas. They did exist, but they were not as big as they are today. And you could imagine if there was rapid population growth, they would want to go out and look for new estuarine sites and try and find a geographical solution to population increase. So that's kind of foreshadowing my thinking about the growth and dispersal of the language family. So there are many competing and irreconcilable homeland proposals about Austroasiatic in the literature going back more than a century. And this, I think the archaeology and the linguistics now clearly puts it somewhere in this ovoid. And I would specifically say that probably the Red River Valley area, basically the area around Hanoi today, is more or less the locus of historical Austroasiatic. And later in the talk, I'll have some more detailed justification for that claim. But you know, if you read my own writings of 10 years ago, you would have found me making completely different claims. With Roger Blench, we claimed a homeland down here in the mid-Mekong. All the literature is rife with competing and ill-supported claims, but I think we've reached a point in the knowledge and also in interdisciplinary knowledge that we can now have much more confidence. But some things have held back Austroasiatic reconstruction and held it back rather badly for a long time. And many of the problems that I think I've solved recently could have been solved, had different attitudes applied, could have been solved in the 1970s or even in the 1920s. There is still no consensus on the higher branching structure of the family. What are the big subfamilies? What are the branching node relations within the family? There's still no consensus on that. And I spent the last decade working thousands of hours on that problem, months at Max Planck Institute in Jena and Leipzig, working on that problem. And I still don't have a solution, but I think I have a workaround, which I'll present tonight. One important skill to have in linguistics is if you think a problem is important but it seems unsolvable, stop investing in what can't bring results and use your imagination to find a way to invest in what will bring results. And it's a very important skill because there are many things in linguistics that have been held up for decades because people would not go around a problem that was in their way. Sometimes it's a real problem, sometimes it's a problem of their own making. Also, Austroasiatic languages are famous for complex vocalism. So languages have 40 or more distinct vocalic nuclei in their phonemic inventories. In fact, depending how you analyze things, it gets very subjective, but there are claims of, you know, up to 70 or so distinct vocalic nuclei in stressed syllables, which seems pretty ridiculous. It's sort of like North Caucasian levels of segmental complexity, right? But there are reasons why. Essentially, there are historical changes that cause doublings of the vowel systems when you get a shift in the consonant, which we sort of understand now. But for many decades, people didn't understand these things, and they would try to align correspondences between vowels, and they would come up with, you know, ludicrous, you know, lines of correspondences, which in classical comparative method would imply distinct phonemes in a proto-language, and it, you know, would just get out of control. And so people began to claim that the neo-grammarian law of regular sound change didn't apply to Austroasiatic. And there are quotes in print where people say this. So it was such a notorious problem. There were large data aggregations made in the early 1900s, and even better aggregations, well-organized ones made in the 1970s and 80s, although they were not sort of shared with people officially until the 2000s. But certainly people would circulate stuff amongst themselves. So we've actually had very good etymological data over most of the branches of the family for more than a century. And so there's a lot of problems that could have been solved early on, but for concerns such as, well, if we don't know how the branches coordinate, what do we know to reconstruct? If we can't align correspondences, well, what can we reconstruct? And the other thing is that it was always a very small field. And there were also periods when people were also just not working on these sort of comparative problems. So there are times when small conferences were held and people just wouldn't talk to each other or wouldn't share their work. It's very difficult to get productive collaboration. Often factors like strong national rivalries or other irrational psychological factors were at work. So over this more than a century of comparative Austroasiatic work, there were many individuals who made fantastic contributions and solved particular problems. And if they could only have talked to each other, it would have made a big difference. But often their aims, methods, and ideas were dramatically discordant. We have to pay very special respect to Charles Otto Blagden, who was appointed by the British Foreign Office to Malaysia in the 1890s, and he actually set about collecting word lists for all the Aslian languages in the Malay Peninsula, and these were all published in 1905. But it wasn't just that. He went through every book he could find, every lexicon he could find for every other Austroasiatic language, and actually added all the comparisons he could find into that. So there's actually like a 2,000 item, 500-page comparative Austroasiatic dictionary already in 1905. At the same time, you had Father Wilhelm Schmidt, and he, in a series of papers, attempted comparative reconstruction of a number of branches of Austroasiatic, and he also believed that it was linked to Austronesian. It's not, I'm sorry, but he believed it was, and that's the origin of the so-called Ostric hypothesis. But Schmidt worked in a strictly neo-grammarian framework, and he believed in family trees, descent with modification, that kind of thing. But the fellow he should have been working with, Blagden, at the same time, he didn't believe in any of that. He was a diffusionist, and he didn't have a coherent theory about descent with modification, about branching relations. He believed that if words that were cognate over great distances, it was because somehow the word had diffused, not that a population had moved or had split and moved or something like that. So these two characters were quite important in the early 20th century. And then, but there were many objections, and a lot of scholars denied that there was an Austroasiatic family at all, or that it involved languages such as Vietnamese or Munda. And Audricourt really made the big breakthrough when, in the 1950s, he showed that Vietnamese, as a monosyllabic tonal language, its tones, its phonological forms and shapes are entirely derived from its Austroasiatic heritage. It's not, as some people believe, a Thai language. It's not, as some people believe, a Chinese language. If you unpack all of the changes that created the 6 tones and the very particular segmental values and syllable shapes, all of them derive 100% from the Austroasiatic material. And so the precursor to Vietnamese is a language much more like Khmu or Palang that's spoken today and has, disyllables and clusters and lots of vowels and no tone. And that was a conceptual breakthrough that just because there's tremendous typological variation across the Austroasiatic family, it doesn't mean they don't all derive from a common origin. By working out the typological restructurings that have occurred, we can show how all of the Austroasiatic languages derive from a common source. And a common source that has some daughters today that are still very, very much looking like the proto-language. Hans-Jürgen Pino, I'm sorry, I don't have an image, but his very famous Besuch einer historischer Lautlehre der Karelsprache, despite its modest title, was actually a comparative Munder and Munder Austroasiatic reconstruction, which also helped to pull it all together. And by the 60s, we then had a very good basis for understanding that there is an Austroasiatic family. There are reasons why all these languages belong to the same family, and we can begin to organize cognate sets, find correspondences, and work out historical changes. And Harry Shorto, basing himself on Blagden's work, he came up with an etymological dictionary of Mon, and later on the Shorto Mon Khmer Comparative Dictionary that I published posthumously in 2006 is basically his etymological dictionary of Mon, but reversed. Instead of having the Mon heads and all the different Austroasiatic cognates under the Mon head, he creates sort of dummy heads, which people unfortunately mistakenly treat as reconstructions, and he puts all the cognates under those. David Thomas of SIL, who I had the pleasure of meeting, he was a very important figure in the history of Austroasiatic studies because he had under him many young, enthusiastic missionary types in Vietnam in the 1960s who went off into the hills and into Laos and Cambodia and Thailand and so forth. And he inspired many of them to not just collect word lists and try and do Bible translations, but also because of their Christian motivation, they wanted, literally to get to the history of the language, to get back to the Tower of Babel, so to speak. And so he encouraged his people to do comparative reconstruction. And out of the 60s, we have actually many low-level reconstructions of Austroasiatic subgroups that arose directly from Thomas, inspiring his missionary followers. So regardless of his motivations, a tremendous contribution was made to comparative linguistics. Gerard de Flotte, who recently passed away, spent a lifetime collecting data on the languages and publishing some reconstructions. In fact, his earliest work, low-level reconstructions on Aslian subgroups in the Malay Peninsula, is probably ultimately his biggest contribution, because I think in as early as 1968, the young Gerard probably solved the problem of what is the underlying syllable structure and morphological structure of Austroasiatic. And although I think he was wrong about which languages in the Aslian group were conservative, the data he collected will ultimately contributed to my analysis. Michel Felus, a very dear personal friend of mine who recently passed away, he actually was one of the examiners of my PhD thesis. He spent many years in Laos and Vietnam, and he also pioneered the use of philological methods with comparative analysis of field data. So he was a great respecter of the historical Vietnamese writings, historical Lao, Thai, and Chinese written records, etc. And the point is, all of these philological studies give clues about where words come from, what sounds, how sounds should be reconstructed at a certain time because of how they turn up in a foreign text, and we know how to read the foreign text and that kind of thing. So he made a tremendous contribution in terms of how to use philological methods as well as comparative method. And then the last person I'm going to draw attention to is another good friend of mine, Franklin Huffman, who got a Fulbright fellowship in the 70s and spent about 10 years collecting a mass of data, which I've got most of it all up online now, for minority languages in Laos and Cambodia and Thailand. And he actually cracked the code of showing how in syllables, when the initial consonant is voiced or voiceless, it has an effect on the fundamental frequency, or F0. And so the voiced, if you have a voiced initial, you're more likely to have a breathy onset to the vowel and a higher pitch. If you have a voiceless onset, you're more likely to have a creaky onset to the vowel and a lower pitch. And this can cause a bifurcation in the vowel system. And then languages, there was a great, what's called the Great Wave of devoicing that came through Southeast Asia. People have different ideas about it, but somewhere between 1400 and 1750, a great wave of devoicing passed through mainland Southeast Asia, and speakers just stopped making a distinction between voiced and voiceless consonants. But having retained the salience of that high pitch or breathy versus low pitch or creaky on the vowels, they retained the distinctions. And so while a binary distinction in the consonants is lost, a new binary distinction becomes functional in the vowels, and you get a bifurcation of the vowel system. And you might go down from having 35 consonants to having 22 consonants, but then you might go up from having 24 vowels to now having 48. So you had this kind of restructuring processes going on, and it was Frank who kind of schematized this, and really also because he was at Cornell, he got a position at Cornell before he retired, and Flock took it on. He was in a position to teach this to students, who then went on to become the thinkers who were able to then apply these principles across Southeast Asia to solve many problems. Okay, so that's the history lesson part. So there are two big problems that held up reconstructing proto-Austroasiatic. Two big problems were family history structure and the vocalism. Now, when we learn linguistics, when we learn comparative linguistics, one of the things we're taught is that a model of nested branching structure is regarded as necessary in order to determine where lexicon can be projected back to in the tree, right? Because if you conceive of the shape of the tree, the leaves at the bottom are the actual lexical reflexes that represent those languages. And if we know the shape of the tree and we have the distribution of the lexicon, we project them back to particular nodes. And some will go all the way back to the root node, some will go to some sub-branches, some will go to some other sub-branches, and we build up a picture of the family in that manner. So you want to know what the shape of the tree is. Well, there are dozens of trees that have been published for Austroasiatic, and a couple of influential ones. Ilya Peiros, this is his lexicostatistical tree from 2014. You can't read those labels, I'm afraid, but he has Nicobarese, for example, the first branch, and then Munda as a second branch, and he's got a root age of something like 9,000 years. Well, that's what comes out of the algorithm. His Deflot's highly quoted 2006 tree, and he doesn't even put a root on it actually, but he kind of didn't believe in roots. But he's got three fundamental branches: Munda, Kasi Palang, which is those northern group languages, and then what he called Mon Khmer, which is all the rest. And he's got Nicobarese down here grouping with Aslian. There's just no correspondence between the trees. And he didn't use lexicostatistics. He looked for what he regarded as groups of lexical innovations, and then he would just sort of intuit how you would coordinate them into a tree. And that's just two examples, but we have 100 years of people coming up with trees, not being able to justify them or why they're different to other people. And it's a big problem. And I've spent a decade trying to come up with a tree for Australasia, and I just can't do it. I just can't do it. And I think the reason is that probably, actually, there was just a rapid radiation from the homeland between, say, 3,800 and 4,000 years ago. And so you don't have the social circumstances to have the formation of multiple levels of nodes that you would have with a very slow process. I think you had a rapid radiation, and therefore at the root, we just have an ill-defined structure. That's my view. Oh,
Sorry, no, that's
go back. Yeah. So the other one is the vocalism problem. So here's David Thomas from SIL, I was telling you about a moment ago. He didn't just tell his people to go out and collect data and do reconstruction. He told them how to do it, because he'd been reading all these "you can't reconstruct vowels" claims, and he said, "Well, of course you can." Right? In his mind, God had sent him there with a purpose, and he was going to fulfill the purpose. And God had made a world that we can make sense of. God gave us brains, gave us the ability to think, and he gave us a world that we can make sense of. And I have to say, although I'm not a missionary type like David Thomas, I had some sympathy for that view. It's a view that helps to motivate me in my work. But he was a creature of the 1960s, and he believed in the phoneme, and so he had a very particular solution. So he said, the comparatists have stated flatly that regular sound laws simply do not exist in Mon Khmer vowels. That's what they used to call Austroasiatic. We don't use the term Mon Khmer anymore. Indeed, no one has yet succeeded in establishing regular sound patterns of vowel correspondences. The solution lies in starting at the very lowest level of comparison, working on adjacent languages to establish proto-forms at that level, and then using these reconstructions as a basis for comparison on the next level. All right, so purely bottom up, and he was thinking purely bottom up in terms of work out what the phonemes are, find out how they string together to discover the words, and then just compare them, and we'll work our way up to the top. And for a generation, a lot of SIL people tried to do just that. And they came up with some very diverse solutions. They didn't converge in their solutions, they diverged in their solutions, because they're all working with their own stuff. They all have their own unique phonemic analyses. You know how you can have some raw data, try to reduce it to phonemes, and one person can have a completely different analysis to someone else, depending on whether you consider something to be complementary distribution or not, so forth, whether things are close enough to be regarded as one phoneme or not, whether you regard a particular slot in a syllable as having one or more segments, and so on and so forth. So that's what happened. And Shorto, he could see this, and he came up with a different prescription. Shorto said, this is writing about 10 years later, so he wanted to get rid of all that variation that was happening from the process I just described. So he said, in a comparison restricted to 2 languages, we would expect a relatively high number of relatively related cognates and a small number of irregular ones attributed to variation. So the idea is pick just 2 languages, one representing one branch and one representing another branch. Remember, we've got nearly 200 languages in the family, but his solution was just pick 2 and find all the cognates and find the regular correspondences between them. And then you would expect there would be some messy residue, right? But just stick with this core of regular stuff. And for his initial restricted comparison, he took Mon and Khmer. Well, he came up, his core system that he came up with was kind of typologically reasonable. But he chose Mon and Khmer, and if you know anything about Mon and Khmer, they were probably the 2 worst languages you could have picked. Because, first of all, they're adjacent. In fact, the Mon lived within the Khmer Empire for more than 1,000 years. And the Khmer established their Angkorian realm, which covered probably half of mainland Southeast Asia, and they built a state. They were like the North Korea of their day. They even went so far as to abolish money and run everything by allocation. And the North Koreans would be proud of them. They ran a perfect socialist state. You had to it's all written down. In the 4th century, they abolished coins. And if you were the farmer, you had to give all your grain to the wat, to the monks. And then you had to make all your usual festivals and propitiations and whatever. And depending on how well you fulfilled your religious duties, the monks would then hand back to you your share, right, of the grain you had contributed to the common granary, and the state used the surplus to build a network of highways, and along the highways there were hospitals, there were hotels, there were postal stations, there was military service, there were property titles. It's very interesting. So like the Khmer Rouge in the 70s, they idolised Angkor because it really was their model of an ideal socialist society. But the point is, that did a number on the language, because that under them, it leveled the Khmer language across the region, and Khmer loans then went into all the neighbouring languages, and Mon, which was a culture of very high art and very high culture, that was also, it contributed to Khmer and vice versa. So you're not going to be able to sort them out and do a reconstruction base for Austroasiatic based on just comparing Mon and Khmer. So if you know my work, you know that over the past 3 decades, I've been systematically going through each branch of the Austroasiatic family and producing book-length comparative reconstructions of each branch. And my original idea was that I would do a thorough reconstruction of each branch, and then when I had them all done, I would use the Thomas method, and then I would compare those and come up with proto-Austroasiatic. But that became unwieldy. It was a project that I could ultimately see myself not finishing, and I was starting to tear my hair out. Now, about 2016-17, I started working on proto-Khmu and proto-Austroasiatic. And while it was just by chance I'm working on these two in parallel. And by chance, I noticed that the southern Aslian languages, Malay and Honorary, I would find words that were identical to words in Khmu. And it just kept happening over and over. And so I started taking notes. And I found that very quickly, if there was an E vowel in South Aslian, there would be an E in Khmu regularly, is the word for bird, jin. Mushroom, this, centipede, the ear. The air vowel, there's only an open, mostly an open air, but regularly corresponding to a closer air in Khmu. But then you have these diphthongs, these ear diphthongs in Khmu, and they would regularly always correspond to an open air in South Aslian. There are some U vowels, U for thigh, this indum, underneath, gum, for whenever there's an U there, there's an U there. Whenever there's an or here, there's an or there. Whenever there's an R here, there's an R here. And when we have the UA diphthong, we have an or. Just like we have an ear diphthong, we have an air. When we have an in Khmu, we have an O or an in Malay. When we have the R vowel, whenever we have a long R in Khmu, we have an R in Malay and Honorary. And that's not all of the vowels, but that's just enough I can put on a slide that you can hopefully follow. And you can see what I'm thinking. I'm thinking, hang on, maybe Harry was right. Maybe Harry Shorto, with his pick 2 languages, maybe he was right. And I've fallen backwards into marmalade, as we say. Right? I've hit the 2 languages that if he'd picked, because he had word lists for these back in the 1970s. If he'd picked these 2 and done his magic back then, things might have been different. So, but where do they fit in the family tree? Don't we need a family tree to justify a reconstruction? Maybe we can just drive around, we're like when the roadworks are in your way, you just drive around it and no one's looking. So I decided to drive around it when no one was looking. Because it occurred to me that Khmu up here in the highlands of northern Laos and the Aslians on the peninsula down here, they never talk to each other. They don't know what each other's doing. They're not, and they don't have the same religion. They don't have, the same monks going backwards and forwards between them like you do in all this central area, right? They don't have trade relations. There's no way that the fact that there's an E in Khmu and an E in Semai for the word for bird is because they learned it from each other. And it's far more likely that they have it as a conservatism, right? Because if you have changes in vowels over time, are all the vowels all going to change in all the same way in two languages that are separated like that have no relation to each other? I mean, no social relation to each other, right? But things are going to change, but if these were innovative languages, how did they all innovate in the same direction? It doesn't make any sense. It's far more likely, by Bayesian inference, that they correspond so regularly because they're preserving archaic forms. How are we on time?
Still about 15 minutes.
We've got enough to take us to midnight, so I'm going to have to cut off at some point. So then we can, so I decided, okay, we're going to do that. And then I decided that we rough up a proto-Austroasiatic phonology and lexicon on that basis, comparing Khmer and South ASEAN. And then we feed into the sausage machine some more meat, right? We feed in Munda, Carthian, Pelagic, Vietic, the rest of ASEAN, and Nicobarese. Why? Well, we know something about the phonology of each of the groups, but also you can pick easily pairwise comparisons between them, multiple ones where they're just not in contact. So where they agree with each other and they agree with this basic system we've roughed up based on my initial reconstruction, which we assume is archaic, right? We've made the phylogeny irrelevant. There may, or I don't even think there was some nested branching structure towards the top of the tree. But even if there was, we've made it irrelevant because we've focused on comparisons where logically the best explanation for their similarity is that they are archaic. And on that basis, I came up with 500 etema and published a list early this year. I'm calling it version 1, and I intend to have extensions and corrections on an annual basis. But we've now got, this is in the Journal of the Southeast Asian Linguistics Society, which I founded in 2007, but I stopped being the main editor in 2014. It's free to download. I don't publish in places where you have to, and basically, as I say here, all the data needed to do this was around since the 1970s, but I've applied the principles that I've just enunciated. And so now we have a list of 500 proto-Austroasiatic. There's the first 10, the first 10, that's the layout in the printed version. Early in the year, we'll have an online version that's much more extensive and extensible. But at the moment, it gives my new numbering. So I've got these AA numbers that I call them, and that's now to be fixed, right? So that you can quote a number and it's unambiguous which etymology you're talking about. It indexes to Shorto's numbers. It indexes to Shorto's glosses, my revised glosses, and then I have separate, there's another innovation, I have separate representations for what I'm calling the morphological word and the phonological word, because you have infixing and prefixing and restructuring of syllables. So I think it's important not to try to pack everything into one proto-representation. You try to have a representation of what you think the word was pronounced like, and then have a representation that explains the morphology of the word. And I think that's just a more informative way of presenting reconstructions, the typology of the language, favors that. So it's all available, and for what it's worth, this is what the phonology looks like. So we have a very boring vowel inventory for proto-Austroasiatic. It looks like the vowel inventory you find in about 40 of these languages. Long and short distinction, 3 degrees of height, 3 degrees of backness. And the only real problem in the vowels that I have is I can't work out whether we have an allophone of long R, which I call OA, or whether that's a separate phoneme. But that's a fairly trivial question, and I might have a solution for that in the new year. Words are either monosyllabic or disyllabic, and most of the time the disyllables are created by infixes or prefixes. So again, that's something we knew about Austroasiatic for a long time. Onset consonants. The usual set are the set we have in white here. Certain correspondents need to posit an extra fricative and an affricate, and also a voiced implosive palatal. They're in yellow here because they represent specific correspondences, but is there some other solution? Do they actually represent clusters, or is there some morphological explanation for them? I don't know, but the point is I'm making it explicit. And the coders, for syllable coders, again, it's the normal ordinary set you get in conservative Austroasiatic languages, and it doesn't normally turn up in notations, but it's a fact that the word final stops always have concomitant glottal closure, and the more conservative Austroasiatic languages, you also have a glottal closure on the final sonorant. So there's some argument about whether about which etema should be marked as having the glottalized sonorants or plain sonorants, but the fact that there is glottalization in the system is not disputed. So that's a kind of phonological summary. And there's a bigger, we can't spend time looking at this, but here's a bigger table. Once we extended with Phalangic, and then we extend with Vietic, and like I say, online there'll be more extensive presentations of this to justify the correspondences. But you can see ultimately we'll be presenting more columns showing the reflexes, and it doesn't matter how many more columns we add. The correspondences we found and reconstructions we proposed based on the Kumul and Semilai, they just seem to hold up. They just seem to be explanatory, no matter what language we add data from. So I'm quite confident that we've lucked on the right data and analysis. So that's the long vowels. That's the short vowels, the same sort of thing. And again, there's no point spending time going through it. So in the time room, what time is it? Okay, so so I'll touch on the homeland argument very quickly. I've counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different published homeland proposals for Austroasiatic. Okay. The most popular historically are up here in China, because if you've got rice lexicon, the assumption is that you're somewhere near the domestication of rice. Oh, that's an argument. Or southwest China, all those great rivers, the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, and the Brahmaputra, and so forth. there's a place in Asia where all those great rivers seem to cluster together, right? Well, wouldn't that be a great place to put your homeland? Because if your homeland is there, everyone gets on a boat and they all just sort of end up in all the places where Austroasiatic languages are. It's an idea. And then the other third big one is that it's somewhere in the Ganges plain or actually Punjab, because as any scholar of Sanskrit will tell you, everything comes from Sanskrit. And of course, if you're a good patriotic Indian Sanskritist, you know that the Gitas were composed in the Punjab, right? Not in Afghanistan, not in somewhere in Iran, not somewhere in Pakistan. They were right there in the Punjab, and of course that's where everything comes from. So Austroasiatic must come from there too. And I could make other numerous remarks, but basically you can see that if you've got all these different proposals and they all have very, very weak underlying arguments, right? There's something wrong. And I think I made my point early on that we can do better. We can reconcile the archaeology and the distribution. Here we go. So let's go quickly through each branch before my voice goes. The Munda languages in India. If you look at them very carefully, they look like they dispersed from the Mahanandi Brahmani Delta region. Like that. They look like they dispersed from that delta. Because all the rivers, if the rivers all run down like this, right? And they all converge on that delta region. Now that delta region is inhabited by Indo-Aryans today, but they've only been there since about 300 or 200 before Christ. So a very strong argument can be made that in fact this is the Munda area and the Indo-Aryans arrived and the Mundas went upriver and up into the hills. I've published several papers on that. You can look them up. There's quite good arguments about it. Kasi Palau. According to my reconstruction, the Pelagic homeland is somewhere here, somewhere near Sipsongfana in China, and they dispersed up the rivers, up the Brahmaputra and across to Meghalaya, across to down the Salween and so forth. And so it's basically an upriver dispersal from a point here in around Sipsongfana. The Pakanic, Hmong and Vietic, here's the Pakanic languages. Here's Hmong. Basically, they're on tributaries of the Red River. So again, these guys, they look like they just as the Pelagics went up the Red River and then up those other rivers, it looks like Hmong and Pakanic, they just went up various tributaries from the Red River. And Vietic, well, they never went anywhere. It's still where it's always been. There's no, in the second millennium, they spread down along the coast. But 2,000 years ago, when the Chinese arrived, the Vietics were just there around the mouth of the Red River. And there's no evidence that they were anywhere else. Kamuic, Benares, and Kamul, well, they're in the along the highlands, the Annamite range today. During the period following the collapse of Angkor, we know that the Katuics spread down into the plains here, and also the Benarics spread down into the plains here, taking advantage of the withdrawal of the Angkorians. And the Khmu, there's no evidence of them ever being anywhere else. but there's actually a long-established trade route between the Red River and Luampabum here, and so it's quite proximal to the Red River. I suppose Katuiks and Benarics, they could have come down the coast, or they could have come down the Mekong River, or maybe they just strung along the mountain range. I don't know, but they didn't really move very far. The Khmers, where are the earliest Khmer ruins? Where are they? They're in the Mekong Delta at Ok El. All later Khmer evidence of Khmer presence is inland. Where is the earliest Mon settlement? It's actually on the coastline of the Bay of Bangkok, but it's not on the present coastline. In fact, the earliest Mon ruins are exactly where the coastline was when the sea level was 1.5 meters higher than it is today. And all other Mon ruins or cultural artifacts are all further inland. So the earliest evidence is right on the coast and when the coast was higher. And the Perik people, who also live in Cambodia, strong indication that their homeland is associated with an estuary right here. It's just near the border with Thailand. Aslian. As I think I've shown, the most historically conservative subgroup of the Aslian is the South Aslian. And the South Aslian are grouped around here, right, which is down here on this map. Okay, and the distribution of the Aslian groups follows perfectly the pattern of the rivers that run inland from the east coast and up into the center of the peninsula. So I'm fairly convinced that proto-Aslians actually landed on the coast here and then moved in and up. And there's absolutely no linguistic evidence of any Austroasiatics on the isthmus here. Then finally, we have to account for the presence of the Nicobarese Austroasiatic speakers. The only way you can get there is by sailing across open ocean. And there's no evidence of anyone else ever being there. Well, hang on a second. The inevitable conclusion is that ancient Austroasiatics were able to navigate across open ocean. Well, in that case, they all could have. So now let's come back and abstract and look at this. If we look at all the movements we're confident about, how many of these could have been accounted for by movement over open water? About 2/3 of them. If we have dispersal from the Red River Valley in people who have open water navigation capacity, they can reach 3/4 of these sites, right, that are coastal, that are estuarine and island, right? They are all very smartly reached over water. The only exception are these northern groups, which are all reached by moving inland upriver, again, from the same initial locus. So we have two fundamental mechanisms. One is we get on a boat and we go looking for another estuarine environment where we can do our nice paddy farming, or we go upriver and try our luck and we do the irrigated paddy. Because as you go up into those hills, you find areas with reliable rainfall, and you have sort of naturally terraced areas and some easily terraced areas, and you can do your rain-fed paddy quite easily. And if we look at our archaeology, 4,000 years ago on the coast, 4,000 years ago on the coast, 4,000 years ago on the coast. It looks to me, these are rice, sites with rice. It looks to me like we have a rapid coastal diffusion right at the time that we've had a couple of 100 years of this ethnogenesis of the late Neolithic revolution in the lower Red River Valley. Is that my last slide? Yeah, that'll do. So I will stop there and you can ask your question.
Okay. So thank you very much, Paul. Great talk. Questions, please.
Sit down.
So do you think that proto-Austroasiatic broke up more or less 4,000 years ago or earlier?
I think very close to 4,000 years ago, because I think that if you have an ethnogenesis event, you have the creation of this new society where they become farmers, they become animal husbanders. They have the ability. They have boats that are using fresh water and open ocean. There's a very quick transformation that's in the archaeological record, which gives them these new capacities. And I think there would have been, after some adjustment period, there would have been quickly increase in population and every reason to keep expanding, to keep moving into new homes. And so I think the archaeology really forces an interpretation that of a very specific window in time when they had the capacity to do it, and we see the sites that correspond to that cultural complex. Was there something else under your question? Because until I started articulating this view, there were people were suggesting very old dates for Australasia. Some people were suggesting 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 years, and no, I don't see it.
So it's substantially younger than was previously.
I think so. You can phrase it that way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thanks so much for your talk. Actually, the question of you like this talk, but in general about Montpellier French. You have told that it's not, no one is using it right now, right?
Yeah, it's a legacy term.
Yeah, but I think, but I think there was some field works, okay, maybe they're from 2014, but there were some work that were still starting this branch and this idea of this branch and division. And why? Maybe you can just give some, you can explain a bit why, like, we cannot divide languages into Munda, Nicobaris, and Monk.
So it goes back to Pino, 1959, his book on Munda, and then the papers derived from that. The Munda languages are highly agglutinated, and they have their prefixing and suffixing and infixing, and you have very long, you can build up very long words. And similarly, the Nicobarese languages have a similar typological profile. The rest of the Austroasiatic family, there are no suffixes, and words are highly constrained in their complexity and length. So there's a fundamental typological cleavage, a sort of east-west typological division. And in the 1960s, the idea firmed up very strongly that those languages that don't have that agglutinating typology, that they're a sub-branch, and they were called non-Khmer, right? And there was a justification for dividing Austroasiatic in that way, and that idea persisted for a long time. And the American phonologists David Stamp and Patricia Donegan, they spent 30 years making arguments that in fact the agglutinating type was actually the original type, and that the so-called non-Khmer languages really are a subgroup. They must have been a small migration that came out of India to Southeast Asia, and then under the Southeast Asian sort of aerial pressure, they simplified. So that idea was quite common, was in print, and it was taught to a lot of people. So the concept of a non-Khmer subfamily, you know, it persists in the literature because, you know, the books and the journals don't vanish just because the ideas have changed, right? So there were reasons for people believing in that simple division of the family, but those reasons don't exist anymore. They were wrong-headed reasons. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Scenario that the initial couple language then like the food production.
Well, after a baby boom. Yeah.
Food production.
So you can symbolize it as a rake or a radial pattern or something abstractly, but I think the scenario is that you have proto-Austroasiatic speakers, and they moved up to many places. It's not the first time this has happened in history. You know, 1,000 years ago, the Chum people did it. They moved from central Vietnam within a very short period of time. They went to Hainan Island. They went to central Cambodia. They went to Aceh. They went to Malaysia. These sorts of instant maritime dispersals have historical precedent. So they move out to these different areas, and over hundreds of years, there are changes. They coin new words, etc., and they form new branches. So we can abstractly represent that as a rake or a radial diagram, but people look at, I have this all the time. People point to my rake diagram that I published, and they say, "Oh, so this is your family tree for Austroasiatic," and I say, "No, that's not a tree. That's not a claim that that's the tree. If you're going to have just a flat rake with 14 legs hanging from it, that's basically a claim that you don't know what the configuration is." And again, I think we can just sort of drive around the obstruction, and we can say, look, they were in a location, and multiple bands moved away in a relative short period of time. And that's all it is.
Biologists don't like polytonic nodes.
Absolutely.
But can I follow up this question because I think it ties into your reconstruction of the vocalism. where you so you take two different branches of Asiatic and see that the correspondences between vowels are more or less the same, so they most likely represent the most archaic model of Austroasiatic. But the problem is that what if, for instance, these particular two groups actually form one single node on the Austroasiatic tree? And in this case, such a vocalic system could be innovative rather than archaic. So basically, you were saying that we don't really need phylogeny to solve the issue of Austroasiatic reconstruction, but in this particular case, we actually do need a little bit of phylogeny.
Well, if I can go back to a particular slide.
Sure.
So, is it? Yeah, oh, yes, right. Yeah. So, it is theoretically possible that South Austroasian and Austroasian and Australian here and Khmer here formed a subgroup before everybody split out from the homeland. But the problem is these remarkably good correspondences actually are found with some very minor variation in all of the peripheral groups. So for centipedes, we always find an E vowel in Kasi, in Nickaburese, in Munda. For thigh word, we always find an U vowel in Pelagic, in Kasi, in Munda, in Nickaburese as well, etc. And I can go through the list. So are we saying that all the geographically peripheral groups are a sub-branch?
Okay, I see
Right?
what you mean. So
it's unlikely.
But it's like a hub system from which it is very convenient to explain the systems in all the other branches. Something like, Middle Chinese, where we take Middle Chinese, and it's very convenient to explain all the dialects of Chinese from the phonemic and phonetical structures of Middle Chinese.
I see what you mean, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm saying here is that the most divergent changes in the vocalism are found in these languages here, what I'm calling central, geographically central. Right? Whereas we have astonishing parallelism in what I'm calling peripheral, which is all the circle groups. Right? And you would expect there to be, because we have phonological restructuring that we understand, which caused big vowel changes in Mon and in Khmer, especially. And we know those two languages had strong social influence over all of this central area. So we're not surprised that we have sort of divergent values in this area. But we have remarkably concordant values in all of the peripheral areas that weren't affected by Mon and Khmer. So it strikes me that actually it's a very conservative system, and I could have just started with comparing, say, Pelagic and Munda, or Kasi and Aslian or something, and I still would have ended up at the same place in the end.
Okay. Any other questions? Still have a few minutes. Question, please.
I have a series of questions. The first one, what I time is something you have said about Indian homeland. You mentioned Punjab. What exactly are you said about?
So in India, there's a strong linguistic tradition, and it's revolves around the study of Pali and Sanskrit and classic texts such as the Rigveda. And the Indian nationalist view is that those texts originated in the Punjab, right? Now, the classic Indo-Aryan text.
Oh, okay.
So, right, so if you're an Indian nationalist, right, you will argue that those texts originated in India, in the Punjab area, right, or proximal to it, right? I don't believe that's the real history, right? But there's among linguists in India, there are strong nationalistic tendencies. Now, yes. So now, people like Michael Bitzel have said, if you look at Sanskrit, there are words that don't have Indo-European etymology. And he asks, where did they come from? And he says, oh, well, many of them must be Austroasiatic words. What? Because that's the other group we know was in India, right? That's their logic. And if we believe that the Indo-Aryans were in the Punjab and they have a chunk of Austroasiatic vocabulary in their language, that must mean that the Austroasiatics were in the Punjab. And so that is the argument one must make at conferences and in journals and talking to the press and so forth, if you are a patriotic Indian linguist.
Yeah, now I understood. Then next my question is about the author or author. Because I read your paper on maritime hypothesis, yeah, and I was a bit surprised that you never mentioned there copper for culture that is using more than West India, but it is I thought I'm not a specialist in anthropology, but I thought that
Well, all I can say is I don't see any evidence for a connection. So it's very common in India, right, that people find archaeological assemblages or stories about ethnic groups, mythology, etc. Whenever it's not Indo-Aryan, they like to ascribe it to Austroasiatic. Yeah.
Mostly to Dravidian, but what is your opinion on works of Jantrowski on the Austroasiatic trade?
It's utter nonsense.
Okay.
There is no basis to it whatsoever. There are some later place names. There are some place names, for example, that have the dark word for water in them and stuff like that. But they don't, there's no evidence that places people in a great time depth in those locations. But the fact that something is, and also the basic arguments are that they talk about the prefixes. They talk about prefixing languages, right? And the certain sounds, such as the velar stop, are a common prefix, and the velar stop is also a common prefix in Austroasiatic. Very vague typological parallel. Right? So it's very easy to make some vague typological parallels, find some words that look like this, look like that, and propose a substrate. But nonsense. There are other nonsense. Sorry. The same thing happens in China, okay? So in China, there are works which will list hundreds of parallels between Austroasiatic and ancient Chinese. Well, these Austroasiatics must have been everywhere. You see? The point is the claims are weak to begin with, and other claims elsewhere in the world, which are just as weak and based on exactly the same principles, are being made. So either one of them's wrong, but logically they're probably both wrong. You see? And we've had a century of people looking for evidence of ancient Austroasiatics in India or interacting with Indo-Aryans. And none of it holds up to scrutiny. None of it.
Okay. Yeah, and what you think about some of these in the part of right?
Well, he has, okay. So Shorto's dictionary it's called a comparative dictionary. It's not called an etymological dictionary. It's called a comparative dictionary. And the function of Shorto's dictionary was to simply aggregate every possible comparison that he had found in the literature that anyone had made, to aggregate them all and organize them under heads. The etymologies in Shorto's dictionary are not actual claims that this was the form or that these are necessarily related. It is just, it's a research aggregation. It's not a set of claims. And this is not made clear because his introduction was not like, I didn't have the complete introduction available to me when I edited it for publication. And it was only later when I got access to the rest of Shorto's papers that I was able to in fact work out what he was doing. So the Shorto dictionary is a collection of all possible comparisons he could find. But no particular comparison in that book should be treated as a claim that the particular words are related, even though many of them are. That's not the function of the book.
No?
Okay,
My final question is not from me, but from my colleague who is in room, maybe.
yes, but I suppose that we already know the answer to that question more or less. Let me bring up the chat because she was, it's a question from Zhenya Rinkovska, who was asking about the factor of comparative methodology, and I won't read the entire question, but basically it's the spread of some myths that may be Mundan in origin, and the final question is, so is it possible that the Austroasiatic people were spread in India over a wider area than the present-day Munda, based on mythological contacts, I guess, between different peoples?
The way these mythological contacts are maybe connected with the lexicon yeah,
Mm-hmm.
finds like more because in my family there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if we can rely on mythology in that way.
Yeah, I guess so.
So, because mythology, comparative mythology can throw up some very strange results. So, for example, you know, Southeast Asia was Hinduized in the first millennium. And then Buddhism came later and displaced Hinduism. But the Hindu rituals and stories remained with a lot of people who forgot that they were Hindus. Right? And when French ethnologists came to Vietnam in the 1800s, they found Highlanders in Kon Tum, Pleiku, etc., performing Hindu rituals that were no longer performed anywhere in India and were only recorded in ancient literature.
But it's not a Hindu myth.
Well,
It's
whether it's a myth or a ritual, it's a story. It's a cultural artifact, right? So the distribution of stories and other cultural artifacts can have nothing to do with, it can be quite independent of the linguistic group or how the languages spread, is my comment.
separately.
So it can be together or it can be separate, but you need some evidence. You need some reasoning to come to some conclusion. And so I can't answer that question. It's not
Okay, I think it's
in my competence.
time for us to wrap up, but I think Andrei Kipik also had
No, I
one
want to
question.
withdraw my questions. It's too late.
Oh, we can ask it
Yeah.
later. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I think it was one of the best talks we got in quite a long time. Thank you very much. And we recorded everything, so we can, I think everybody can re-listen later if we missed some.